Good evening, and thanks so much for your time. And I'm not sure if you heard earlier when we ran a piece where we asked other South Africans what they thought of this ruling, and they're like, it's my child, I gave birth to my child, the Constitution did not, it's the right way. So many, I think there's a division out there as to, whether this is something to do or not to do. And I think let's just emphasize why, especially after we have this joint sitting in Parliament about violence, this is so important.
Well, I think, Yuveka, and to the to the viewers out there, it's really important that we understand our really incredibly high levels of violence are driven by multiple factors, and one of it is really children's experiences of violence very early on in life. So when we talk about corporal punishment in the home, you can't distinguish between what is abusive behavior and what is corporal punishment, because how do you determine what is reasonable in a state of anger and what is enough? Yeah. So it's very subjective, and for that reason it becomes really difficult. And I think the court made a ruling today that's absolutely correct in protecting children's rights. The court in the judgment very clearly says that this is in the best interest of the child, because as parents, the physical forms of punishment, there are other mechanisms to discipline. There aren't just physical forms of punishment. And that was one of the judgments made today, is that actually, because there are other forms of discipline as well, we should be looking at positive forms of discipline. But I think it's really critical that we understand our incredibly high levels of violence that we're experiencing and that we've seen in the media.
And is there a link?
Definitely, it's really driven. So if you start looking at what are driving violence in South Africa, the drivers of violence, certainly we start seeing really early on, if there's not proper attachment to a parent early on and there are violent forms of discipline early on, you find a child, the interaction with the parent, then if they're physically disciplined, if physical forms of punishment are used, they use it in their own way, so their behavior becomes more aggressive. And you see that in really young children already. As children become older, peer-on-peer violence become normalized, because that's the way you resolve conflict.
And then it becomes a cycle, doesn't it?
It becomes a norm.
Your child ends up being the bully or the one that hit another child. You can't take them home and smack them for hitting another. It just doesn't make sense.
And one has to understand violence against women and violence against children are so deeply linked. So children who are exposed to violence in the home, and we know that our research in South Africa is showing us that when a boy child sees his mother, just witnessing his mother being abused by her partner, could be his father or not, there's a direct link to him becoming a perpetrator of violence himself towards his partner as well as to his own children. And similarly for women who are exposed, so young girls exposed to violence in the home themselves,
it becomes acceptable. It becomes how a man should treat me.
It becomes a norm.
How a person should treat me. So people out there, Shana, is going, okay, so what do I do then? How do I discipline a child who is extremely badly behaved, not,
I think the hard work starts now. I really think that the hard conversations need to be had, because we're all going to say, but we were punished as children, we're okay. Yeah. And I really think we need to reflect on how okay we are. But there is positive mechanisms of discipline, which means that it's not disciplining in a different, so it means you've got to think about how you discipline, but it's also about that relationship, building positive relationships with your child early on, and for alternatives to be put in place. So it's about children understanding. It's not just about saying, no, you can't do this, but explaining to children, because I think that really also will make us understand that there is different ways of communicating. We see school violence is a huge problem, and it's because children are using violence against each other rather than saying, how do we negotiate conflict? We're not able to resolve conflict, and we see that in adults as well.
So where does this take us in terms of children knowing their rights, the children who will know, and knowing where to go if something is happening at home, if the spanking, it happens. It's all good and well to say it in court. Who's keeping an eye on whom?
I think that's a difficult thing, because on the one hand, parents are saying, this has been taken away from us, we're going to be policed. But I don't think we've got all the right mechanisms in place yet. So I think on the one hand, this is the first step. We've got to start thinking about what are the reporting mechanisms and how children can access reporting mechanisms. So in the Western Cape, they're advertising for a children's commissioner, for instance.
Oh, okay.
So there are some mechanisms in place that will allow us to start thinking about it, but I also think we need to start connecting the dots. On the one hand, the President's speaking about the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. It's really important that we start connecting all of these issues, because what's happening to children is not in isolation to what's happening to women out there. And therefore, when we're costing and funding this plan, we've got to start thinking about how do we cost and also include in these plans ways of supporting parents to understand what is positive discipline, and for parenting programs to be rolled out at a much larger scale.
And children a safe place to go
exactly.
where they can tell someone. Okay.
So, and that needs to be included in the President's plan.
Shanaz, thank you very much. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but we could go on talking about this for a very long time. That's Shanaz Matthews there. Thanks.